Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the week 4 lecture. So just to pick up where we left off, again, just keep in mind that Colombia inhabits a world of women. And what we see in volume 1, a lot of what we see really positions women as vitally important to the formation of a new nation and a new culture. So some critics have sort of argued that one of the projects Ralston is trying to achieve here in the novel is to kind of argue for a little more attention to be paid to both women and Native Americans in the sort of early history of America, to sort of acknowledge the roles that women and Native Americans played in the creation of America, and I think that's probably true. But we also have to acknowledge that Ralston is not totally inclusive. She certainly is interested in Native American history to an extent, to an extent. And she is interested, obviously, in the social roles that women play, but she's almost exclusively focused on white women or noble Native American women. We see virtually no mention of African American characters in this novel, and that will remain true in volume 2. So that's obviously problematic. And, you know, she's not including all of the various groups that played roles, or even all of the major groups, but she is interested in the Native American perspective, at least more so than most American writers would have been. But again, there's a lot of issues that we're going to discover here momentarily about her portrayals of Native American characters. But we can feel pretty good about the way she's sort of positioning a lot of her women characters as independent, educated, obviously virtuous. That's a big part of it, and we'll talk more about that. But also, we just have this sort of extended set piece in Volume 1 that I mentioned a little bit before, where, you know, Columbia is going through all of these old papers. She's learning about her family history. But I want you to notice that as she's digging through all of that, she's relying primarily on the testimony and the recollections of other women. So remember, she's kind of rebuffed by her mother, Isabel. She asks Isabel some questions. She's trying to find some answers about what happened with Isabel and Sir Thomas Arundel, and sort of just more details about the lineage of their particular family. And Isabel is sort of depressed and unwilling to help. So instead, Columbia has to go back through these old papers, and many of these old correspondences are written by women. So she's reading a lot of letters written by, I guess it would be her great-grandmother, Bettina, the wife of Christopher Columbus, who wrote letters to her granddaughter, Isabel, Columbia's mother, sort of instructing Isabel on the proper ways for women to behave, which again kind of comes down to virtue, but also intelligence. A certain degree of agency is kind of stressed for women throughout the book. And again, knowing a little bit about Ralston's bio makes that easy to understand. But critics and scholars really think that this sequence of Columbia kind of going through the papers, reading, learning. She also reads letters written by Christopher Columbus, kind of documenting some of his exploits. Again, that's almost all fanciful and made up, but there are nuggets of truth. So again, he's sort of just surprised to find when he returns to Hispaniola, the island that now houses the Dominican Republic and Haiti. When he returns to that original settlement that the Spaniards established, he's shocked to find that the administrators he left in charge have been very cruel to the native inhabitants, and he tries to put it right. Again, that's not accurate, but that Roldan figure, who was one of the administrators who perpetrated great outrages on the local native populations, he's a real person from history, and Columbus really was sent back to Spain in chains as a prisoner. And that had a big impact on him for the rest of his life, but he wasn't like innocent and wrongfully accused. He was sent back in chains because there was an uprising, but it was largely based on his inept administration and rampant cruelty. So again, Ralston takes the historical facts that she needs, and the ones that are inconvenient for her narrative, she sort of glides right over them. But anyway, the important thing to remember is that Columbia is the one doing this exploration through the papers. She's learning. Everything that we're getting from Columbus or his wife or these other figures, it's all kind of getting filtered through Columbia, who is kind of the centerpiece of most, not all, but most of the narrative action in Volume 1. So she's reading letters, in some cases, written by women, and then she turns to Cora, the Inca servant who followed Isabel back to England all those years ago. Well, actually, I would say followed Isabel's mother. I think she waited on the Inca princess, Columbia's grandmother. So she's very old now, Cora is, but she's still, a family servant, treated relatively well, but let's not mistake it. She is a servant and she is in a subordinate position, but she's able to fill in some of the details that Columbia still wants to learn, particularly details connected to the marriage of Columbia's parents, Isabel and Sir Thomas Arundel. So Arundel is another figure taken directly from history, but again, a lot of important details are changed. We'll get to that in a moment. I'm kind of getting out of order here, but just pay attention to that sequence as Columbia is reading and learning. That really takes us, like I said, about halfway through Volume 1, and it's very important when you think about the larger project that Ralston is sort of, invested in here. There really is a female agency at work, and it might be connected to Ralston's own role as a writer, an educator. Remember, she's trying to educate here. But just to go back to kind of show you an example of the history that she is providing in Volume 1 and this weird mixture of fact and fiction. I just picked out one example. There are many. But if you turn to page 63 in my edition, you'll see this really abrupt turn on the second half of the page, the last two paragraphs on page 63. You see this abrupt transition from kind of a fanciful, romantic retelling of Columbus's, voyages of conquest, compared to a much more realistic passage that follows in the very next paragraph. So I won't read this stuff to you, but just notice the short paragraph on 63, beginning with "upon their marriage." So we hear that the Inca king, Orizombo, very willingly consents to have his daughter marry Ferdinando, Columbus's son, and he just willingly gives a bunch of his land to Columbus and agrees to have his kingdom ruled by the Spanish form of government. It's all very bloodless. It's all very amiable. Everybody's happy and getting along because in this version, Columbus and Ferdinando are very nice to Native Americans, and Columbus is perfectly fine with his son marrying the Inca princess. And this is, of course, frankly, a bit ludicrous if we're trying to accurately capture history, but that's not necessarily what Ralston is doing. Again, this is mythology. There's supposed to be a fictional element to historical fiction. So at the time, at least, this is okay. This is the origin myth. It's supposed to be heroic. It's not supposed to... Our family tree can't be full of killers and liars. They have to be noble and virtuous. So, anyway, I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah. So, very hard to believe that this would be the interaction between Columbus and Orizombo, the Inca king. But then look at the very next paragraph. We have a turn to realism. But notice what happens first. All of the good colonizers, Columbus, his son, now his son's wife, their attendants, all the good people go back to Europe. And after they leave, things get bad. So if you look at that bottom paragraph on page 63, alas, Avarice had discovered this new world was an inexhaustible mine of wealth. And all of these other Spaniards, not Columbus, not the Columbus crew, but these other guys, these pirates, these bad guys, they take advantage of the opportunity after the Columbus crew leaves, and then they are the ones that oppress the Native Americans. They are the ones that rape and pillage and take all the wealth for themselves. It's not Columbus, right? So he's almost like this unwitting catalyst. Like he sets up these settlements and then he leaves only to come back later and it's like, oh man, you guys are being really mean to my Native American friends. So again, Ralston is threading this needle, right? She wants to elicit sympathy for Native Americans, and she wants to be pretty honest and realistic about the destruction, the bloodshed, the really unimaginable loss of life that was taking place during this time period. I don't think she dwells on it very much, but she does have some passages where she will sort of frankly admit, not just here in Peru, but also back in Hispaniola as well, there were great outrages committed against the native populations, great injustices, great violence, but they were always carried out by these bad, corrupt administrators who only function, or pirates in some cases, who only really function as like tangential characters. We don't know much about them. We don't care about them. They are not developed. I would argue that Ralston doesn't really develop any of her characters super well, but she certainly does not develop characters like Roldan or these bad guys in Peru. They're just the bad guys. It's just important that we understand that all the bad things in the colonies happen when those guys take power, and only after the Columbus crew is back in Europe. So this is an example of this mixture of fact and fiction that can sometimes seem jarring, I think, to readers. But again, it wouldn't have seemed particularly unusual at the time. And some of you who read like speculative fiction or a lot of contemporary historical fiction, you might notice that these techniques are still kind of used today. Like Ralston's really not doing anything totally crazy. But again, if we think about her mission of instruction, and the idea that this is like the American history that we should learn, even though it is kind of fictionalized, I think we start to run into some real issues that we might still be dealing with today. Like we don't always acknowledge certain parts of our history, or if we do acknowledge them, we're kind of making excuses at the same time, and we're trying to exonerate certain historical figures like Columbus, who really was celebrated as a hero, like well into the 20th century. I would argue into the late 20th century, when I was still a child. We were supposed to think of him as a brave, intrepid explorer, and yeah, some bad things happened to Native Americans, but that really wasn't his fault. That was the fault of these nameless bad guys who wanted gold and were just sort of greedy, bad dudes. Like, I mean, I'm making it into a little bit of a joke, but that is kind of, or it was kind of, a dominant strain of American history for a long time. So we have to reckon with what Ralston is doing, because in some ways, it's not just what she did. It's what a lot of writers and educators did when teaching American history for quite a long time. And I think it's changing now, but I think it's been a relatively recent development. So by chapter 9, which in my edition is page 96, Columbia has finally finished going through all of her mother's papers. So at this point, she turns to Cora to fill in the extra details about Sir Thomas. So we learn a little bit about this guy. Again, a real historical figure. In the book, he's an English Protestant nobleman who, of course, falls in love with Isabel, even though they have different religions. Isabel is a Catholic, and Sir Thomas is a Protestant. They fall in love and marry anyway, and then he is falsely accused of taking part in some kind of Catholic plot. even though he's not really a Catholic, but he gets executed and dies relatively young. But by that point, Columbia has already been conceived. So there's a footnote in the book that explains a little bit about the real life Arundel. He was a real English nobleman, but in reality, he was a Catholic. And he was executed because he was plotting against, prominent Protestants. So again, Ralston does this a lot. She'll take the facts that are convenient and she'll take the character, but then she'll change certain things about that character. So in her version, because she's generally pro-Protestant, not all of her Catholic characters are depicted unfavorably, but she certainly has a preference. And I think she wants us to see that a lot of the Catholic characters tend to be kind of extreme or sort of given to extremism and radicalism. And that's especially true of the Catholics in England. We see a little bit of that later in Volume 1. So she wants Sir Thomas to be a Protestant who's just accused wrongfully of being a Catholic, when in reality, he really was, and he was a conspirator. Like, he wasn't wrongfully accused. We might argue that he didn't deserve to have his head cut off for that offense, but that's kind of how they dealt with things back then for a lot of crimes. So that's Sir Thomas in both reality and as we see him in the novel, that we see that change, but he's very noble and virtuous and great. Okay, so Columbia descends, again, from royalty on her father's English side, and then on the side of Isabel, we have that combination of the Columbuses and the Native Americans in South America, the Inca Empire, which was the largest population center in South America. So, okay. All right, so Columbia learns all about that, and by chapter 10, Cora's narrative is over, and we've finally gotten all the backstory that we need. We're over 100 pages in, but we finally have all the details that we need, all the exposition in some ways. But again, I like how it's delivered, because this is kind of it's almost a trope that shows up in a lot of modern fiction too, where readers, a character will kind of function as a reader, and the character will discover things by reading documents or like old diaries. Like Faulkner loves this kind of set piece. Faulkner has a lot of scenes where characters, always men though, of course, for Faulkner, are sitting down and like going through family papers or old ledgers. And of course, for Faulkner, those characters often discover things like, their family's slave owning history, or mistreatment of African Americans, or even illicit interracial relationships. But it's that same basic idea of having a character function like a reader, and then the author can deliver all the things that character is reading to provide that important information to the actual audience. But it's presented as if the character is the one consuming it. So this is like a learning process for Columbia. Columbia is a young woman being instructed. So it's kind of meta. It's kind of fun because, again, this is Ralston's whole purpose, is to educate the youth. People like Columbia. Again, she owned a school for girls. A lot of her educational aims were directed specifically at young women because the sexes weren't really educated together yet at this time in American history. So Columbia is almost like her ideal student. But Columbia also represents America. And then Columbia is also a literal character in this fictional narrative. So to me, Columbia is a really interesting figure just because of all the different sort of registers or levels on which she operates. But it's not until chapter 10 that we can really get into the main narrative thrust of Volume 1, which, of course, consists of Columbia falling in love with the noble Sir Egbert Gorgeous, the arrival of the rake character that should remind us of Major Sanford. In this case, it's Sir James Howard, who's a Catholic, and he seduces Mina, the waiting woman and friend of Columbia. So you guys can follow the plot probably from that point on. It's a kind of conventional, somewhat melodramatic, kind of action-packed sort of sequence of events, but a lot's going on. So at the same time, Isabel has taken in this orphan child, and the Catholic radicals are trying to get the kid. So that's why Sir James Howard comes to their castle and seduces Mina so he can get closer to the kid. But then he falls in love with Columbia, so he kind of imprisons Columbia and Isabel. And meanwhile, Mina, who's a minor character, but we do spend some time with her in Volume 1, and she's kind of the only fun, sort of interesting character at times. She functions in the Eliza role here. I hope you guys notice that as you progress in Volume 1. She is the coquette of Volume 1. She's even described that way at one point. So you should pay attention to this, and the whole seduction plot that we've already talked about gets played out here when Howard shows up at the castle and promptly decides to seduce Mina. So this takes us back to an important idea, another sort of recurring feature. You might almost think of it as sort of like a motif, a recurring feature that shows up throughout the novel, and it's this concept of virtue, but a specifically feminine virtue. So going back to those letters that Bettina was writing to Isabel, they're very much about how women should behave, the proper conduct for women, this combination of virtue and learning and a sort of strength of character, a certain like stoicism almost. But I also want you to notice how important it is here in this book for women to avoid vanity, to avoid what is at one point called all frivolous pursuits. And this shows up a lot in the seduction plots that we talked about and the sentimental novels that Ralston also wrote. And it shows up here. And it's a message that Columbia receives loud and clear. Like her mother, she has almost unassailable virtue. Like nobody can really get her to compromise her principles. And Howard tries. Howard tries to seduce her too. But Mina is presented as less strong, less virtuous. She's likable, much like Eliza is. She's likable and witty and charming. And she's presented, like Eliza, as very attractive. And so is Columbia. But unlike Columbia, who has that strength of character and is not vain or is not particularly shallow, she's able to overcome those potential pitfalls. Mina does not. Mina is more easily flattered. She is presented as a coquette. Again, she's described that way, I think, at one point. So it's not really a surprise that she falls victim to Howard's machinations, but more importantly, Howard uses her to gain intelligence about this kid that he's trying to kidnap, and he eventually does, or he tries to. I can't even remember. Isabel sends the kid away. He somehow takes hold of Isabel and Columbia. He has them under his power for a while before they eventually get loose. But it's also important to remember that Mina dies, and Mina meets the same fate that most coquettes meet, the same fate that Eliza met. She has a child, and she dies. And that child her lineage kind of matters because I think it's her grandson, Howard Fitzhoward, which is a comical name. He shows up on the scene later to do some dastardly stuff. So as they point out in the intro, some of the Catholic characters do kind of lean a little bit towards malevolence at times. And again, that's sort of a testament to Ralston's position on religion, but also Mina's offspring is not very virtuous. That offspring of Mina and James Howard, like that's kind of corrupted from the start, and their family line is not nearly as good as the virtuous family line that we see with the whole Columbus family tree. So just keep Mina in mind as well, because even though this is a matriarchal vision of American history, the women that take part, they have to be certain types of women. There's not really much place for women like Mina or Eliza because they lack some of the key traits that the women in this narrative and Ralston herself seem to privilege and sort of prioritize. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, all these things are happening. It's a very eventful plot once we get into the kind of past the 100-page mark. And then eventually After all these trials and tribulations, Columbia and Sir Egbert end up together. And then the offspring of their union ends up being Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who again is a real figure from history. He was an early colonizer in New England. He would help to found what would later become Maine. But he was not, in real life, a descendant of Christopher Columbus. So Ralston's taking this real historical figure and again fictionalizing him. But this is the character, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who finally gets us to North America, by my count, on page 154. So he goes over there as part of one of these early colonizing missions, and he becomes kind of a prominent figure. So clearly Ralston is in no hurry here. Volume 2 is more about America. Volume 1 is the backstory, and it's the establishment of this family tree. So we don't actually get to America, physically, North America at least, until pretty near the end of Volume 1. So Sir Ferdinando Gorges only has a daughter who he names Isabel in honor of his grandmother. So it gets very confusing because a lot of these names get repeated. But he also adopts the son of his sister Elizabeth, Henry. So his sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Columbia, she ends up marrying into another noble English family, the Dudleys. But then her husband dies early. This is another recurring trend. A lot of these men die quite early, right after they impregnate their wives. They die, and then children grow up without them, largely. But anyway, Sir Ferdinando does not meet an early death. He adopts his nephew, Henry, and his daughter, Isabel, grow up together and then creepily fall in love, even though they're first cousins. And this was it wasn't totally uncommon for first cousins to have relationships back then, but even their own parents kind of discourage it. And often it was thought that like second cousins, third cousins, that's fine. First cousins, kind of too close for comfort. But anyway, it doesn't matter to them. Henry and Isabel eventually do get together. They marry, but then Henry is murdered by Howard FitzHoward, the dastardly grandson of Mina, who is trying to seduce Isabel, and he's friends with Henry, but then kills him in this sort of in this hand-to-hand combat. But by that point, Isabel is already carrying Henry's child, so Henry dies, but Isabel then gives birth to Edward Dudley, who goes back to England to be educated, but then he returns to New England, and like his forefathers, he becomes kind of an important figure in early New England society as the English settlers are trying to get a foothold there. So he becomes established, and then along with his wife Arabella, he kind of sets up shop in New Hampshire, and they have 2 children, William and Rachel, both of whom are kidnapped by a marauding band of Narragansett Native Americans. So the Narragansetts were, a pretty powerful tribe, originally native to, I think, Rhode Island and sort of those neighboring states. They put up some pretty fierce resistance to the English settlers throughout sort of the second half of the 17th century. So they kidnapped the 2 kids, and then William and Rachel grow up in the tribe. So this is like a reverse captivity narrative. I'm assuming that some of you read Mary Rowlandson's 1682 captivity narrative, which is quite famous and still read, still taught today. This was another one of those kind of pre-novelistic forms of prose fiction. I forgot to mention these weeks ago when we were talking about pre-novel forms of like long narratives. And this is one of them. Captivity narratives had been around for a long time, but there were several produced in the colonies during the 17th century because this stuff happened a lot. Native American tribes would often take prisoners and kind of ransom them back to the colonists in exchange for certain concessions or other things that they wanted. And then colonists would do the same thing to the Native Americans. The colonists would raid Native American villages and take women and children hostage, and then later there would often be hostage exchanges. So that's what happens with Rowlandson. She's eventually returned to her family after spending like 9 months with a band of Narragansetts. They kidnapped her too. So they did this pretty often. It was a tactic, almost like a negotiating tactic, because a lot of times the English settlers wouldn't negotiate with them otherwise. So they kind of had to force the issue by taking women, often children. So that's what we see here. But William ends up becoming the chief of the tribe. He's sort of adopted by the existing chief. He marries Oberea, which is another Native American princess, and then later he himself becomes chief. So this is really kind of interesting and weird because, again, the captivity narrative was a well-established genre in which white people got captured by Native Americans and then they were able to eventually return to their home, and it was all about their trials and tribulations. That's not what we get here. William and Rachel are taken prisoner, but they're not mistreated. They don't try to get away. They sort of adopt a lot of Native American culture, and they live with the Native Americans, and they become accepted and sort of members of the tribe. This is kind of a progressive plot development for the time period. It was not super common. So again, William takes a Native American wife, but again, she's from noble blood. Oberea is the daughter of a king. So we see this again. And then, meanwhile, Rachel falls in love with a brave warrior named Yanku. So that's kind of interesting because Yanku's more of like a middle-class guy. He's not really royalty, he's just a good fighter, but Rachel falls for him, and then after he dies, she never really gets with anybody else. So anyway, that's enough plot summary, but William eventually becomes a chief. He also dies young, of course, but the offspring of William and Oberea, Reuben, goes to England and to get educated just like his father and grandfather before him. But this is interesting. Rowson points out that he is sort of discriminated against because of his darker complexion and he's of mixed race, of course. His mother is Native American, his father is English. So Rowson even says on page 192, he's denied his inheritance, even though he is the grandson or the great-grandson, now I can't remember, of Ferdinando Gorges. But it doesn't matter because his mother is a Native American. So he's denied his inheritance. And Rowson says the nature of his father's marriage with Oberea in law would have been termed illegal. So this is a pretty realistic portrait of the racism that a character like Reuben would have encountered back in England towards the end of the 17th century. So of course Reuben is a fictional character, but this is a pretty realistic depiction of how he would be received. So he's kind of shunned from English society. He cannot inherit the property that he should be entitled to. So he returns to America, goes back to New England, marries Keziah Penn, a Quaker woman who should put us in mind of the real-life Penn family that helped to found Pennsylvania in reality. But of course, she's a fictional character, and I think she's also a distant descendant of one of Columbia and Sir Egbert's other kids that we never meet. So we don't need to know all about that. Keziah dies right after giving birth to our two title characters. I guess it's like Reuben Jr., really, and his sister, Rachel. The Reuben and Rachel of the title. So these are the children of the Reuben that we see denied in England, right? The Reuben who's the son of the Englishman Native American chief. So again, there's this weird intermixture. And in Volume 2, we're going to spend a lot more time with Reuben and Rachel. We're going to follow their adventures, and we'll discuss Volume 2 next week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you then.